Can we increase the restrictions on trade with China? What are the specific areas that can be targeted? Why are imports continuing to balloon? Despite the fact that post-Galwan, the government has tried hard to try and reduce trade with China. Joining us on this broadcast, representing the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, its national spokesperson Sanju Verma, squaring off against her, Supriya Shrineth of the Congress. For an academic perspective, I'm joined by Professor Santosh Mehrotra. He's at the University of Bath. He's a visiting professor at the Center for Development. Ashwini Mahajan joins us, very important man, national co-convener of the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, an affiliate of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. Prasanjit Bose joins us for a left-leaning perspective. He's an economist and activist. I want to start by asking Sanju Verma that post the Galwan clash, the government made very clear that it would use economic tools to try and choke trade with China, to make it tougher for China to send exports to India, that it will try and reduce Indian imports from China. That, however, doesn't seem to have happened. Instead, trade from China is increasing, imports from China are ballooning, and trade data seems to suggest that your policy of reducing trade with China hasn't worked. Why is that, madam?
You know, Rahul, before answering your question, I think today is an exceedingly proud moment for every Indian, you, me and everybody on the panel, that we finally successfully did that test trial of Agni 5, which has a range of more than 5,000 kilometers, which I think is no mean achievement. Coming now to the crux of your question, I have some data with me. And you know, you can verify this data with the economic survey put out by the government of India from time to time. The trade bilaterally with China for the financial year 2021-22 was $115 billion. In financial year 2020-21, it was $86 billion. Now the moot point which your audience needs to know, and please listen to this very carefully. In financial year 2020-21, what was the overall size of India's trade basket? When I say trade basket, I mean basically our exports plus our imports. The value of our exports plus imports in financial year 2020-21 was $686 billion. Now, what was it in financial year 2021-22? It was $1,028 billion. The limited point I'm making is, in financial year 2020-21, if out of $686 billion, we did a trade of $86 billion with China, that is basically only 12.5% of our entire trade basket, point number one. Point number two, if in financial year 2021-22, out of the total trade basket of $1,028 billion, we did a trade bilaterally with China of only $115 billion. It means with China, we only did trade to the tune of 11.18%. Just 11% of our total trade in financial year 2021-22 was done with China. What is the moot conclusion that we arrive at? In the last 2 years, our overall percentage of trade with China is less than 15%, barely 11 to 12%. So why this whole brouhaha? Now I will just take 30 seconds to tell you why is it that you cannot blanketly, and I'm sure some of the professors on your panel will be happy to corroborate me, why you cannot blanketly ban Chinese imports or, you know, export goods and services to China. India has been a signatory to the WTO right since its inception in 1995.
Okay.
We have also been a signatory, 20 seconds, we have also been a signatory to the Geneva Convention of 1949, the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, of both 1948 and 1984. Now, since we are a stakeholder in these international platforms, you cannot unilaterally...
Okay, so you set the stage for this debate. Supriya Shrineth, there is WTO obligations. Secondly, this will hurt India as well, because if we block trade, China would lose only 3% of its exports, 1% of its imports. India will lose 5% of its exports, 15% of its imports. Those are big numbers that you'll have to deal with. Secondly, while the percentage of trade has gone up post-Galwan, as a percent of overall trade, Sanju Verma makes the argument that China's share as a trading partner to India is actually coming down, so directionally we're headed in the right direction.
No, I want to first raise a few points, and the good thing with data is that you can't circumvent reality. Now, what is the reality? The reality, as pointed out there, was that it is 11% now, it was 12% before. What happened after Galwan? After Galwan, this country was told, and very many people, especially the bhakts, went ahead and destroyed their phones, TV जला रहे थे, phone जला रहे थे. मोदी जी ने भी आंख में धूल झोंकने का काम किया और कुछ ऐप बैन कर दिए. You know, all of those apps that he banned actually has donated to the PM Cares Fund. We are not debating that today, I understand. I'm not going to get into the...
Talk with certain respect.
Okay, Sanju, let us speak. Sanju, let us speak. Go on, go on.
Please do not speak in between.
Supriya.
Do not speak in between. I will not let you... Rahul, if you're okay with doing this debate while she was rambling and I did not speak, I'm fine with it. I can leave and you can have a 1-hour conversation with her. I did not interfere. She should listen to the hard truth. PM Cares Fund mein blood money from these Chinese startups that supposedly were banned in India was taken, not a word on that. There are 3 broad figures that this country needs to understand. $115 billion in 2021-22 was the trade volume with China, $86 billion the previous year, but this government actually inherited a trade deficit. The trade deficit last year, when we were doing a trade with China of $115 billion, the trade deficit was $73 billion because we were obviously importing more from China and exporting less. China, the total trade that China has with us is just 3%, we have over 11%. The trade deficit was $73 billion. But this same trade deficit, they inherited at $36 billion, which has more than doubled. So you have increased India's dependence on China year after year, particularly after Galwan, it is up 35%. Do you have an explanation for that? After Galwan, our trade deficit and our trade dependence on China has gone up and the trade has gone up by 35%. Is there an explanation? And that's not all, Rahul. We are not just debating import and exports. I think the one thing that we are not paying attention to is the amount of Chinese money there is in Indian startups, that entire community that we want to grow and we must grow. Over $14 billion of Chinese money is actually fueling our startup ecosystem. You know how much was it the year before that? $4 billion.
Okay.
Imagine if China wants to play truant, how our entire startup community can come crashing down, the entire economy.
Ashwini Mahajan, as the national co-convener of the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, if we leave the politics between the Congress and the BJP aside, the fact is that post-Galwan trade has gone up by 45%. The fact is that the trade deficit is going up as well. The fact is the government's trying to curb trade with China. It hasn't worked. Are you satisfied with where things are? What are your suggestions on what more should be done to try and curb trade with China? Many, like the professor on the show, Professor Mehrotra, would say it's also impractical.
See, Rahul, I would like to give you the history in 2 minutes and then we can go ahead with this. Since 2001, when China joined WTO, the imports from China, they had been going up and up. And between 2004 and 2014, I'm not talking about the politics, but we have to understand the insensitivity of the governments of the day, like earlier governments and today's government, that has actually led to the increase in the imports and the trade deficit with China. Between 2004 and 14, there was a 3,000% increase in the Chinese imports. And that, especially when we allowed that to happen, we were very proudly saying, as a nation, as a country, as a government, that the imports are at a cheaper rate, and why we should not allow the cheaper goods to come into India and satisfy consumer wants and make our country more competitive. Actually, that didn't happen. It led to the deindustrialization of the country. API industry, telecom, electronics, plastic, everything. We continue to import and our industries continue to be killed. And we reached at a juncture that we didn't have any industry to support us. And then it was said that, oh, China is indispensable, we have to depend upon China. Even today there are people, those who keep on saying that if we stop imports from China, then our industry will not be able to survive, because most of the inputs, most of the intermediates and raw material is coming from China. But we have to put a full stop somewhere, sometime, and this is the right time that we do that. And the government of the day, they had.
So what are you specifically suggesting be done? Kejriwal says there should be a ban on trade with China. Do you go to that extent? Do you think more restrictions should be placed on what we import from China?
We have to, whatever we suggest as Swadeshi Jagarman or as a responsible organization, it has to be according to the international conventions and other things. But yes, the government of the day, previously they were not understanding the impact of the Chinese imports, and they were not raising the tariffs. From 2018, they started raising tariffs, and we have seen the results. We have seen that the imports of electronics and mobile phones, that has come down, and rather exports have increased. But sufficient has not been done. But later on, when the government came out with the Atmanirbhar Bharat production linked incentive scheme, basically production linked incentive scheme for all 15 sectors which have been chosen, is basically designed to control imports from China. And that is the point where we started. But the problem here is that the tariffs are still very low. I tell you, Sanju was talking about WTO and others and everything. I would like to tell the audience through you that our tariffs, the bound rate of tariff is 40%, and we are actually imposing tariff at the rate of about 10%. So there is a scope of increasing tariffs, and while talking to industry, we have found that even if we make a slight increase in the tariffs, that can do wonders. We have talked to the textile industry, we have talked to many other industries, and they are all saying that if we double, say from 10% to 20% on an average, we do, that can do wonders. And secondly, what we have to do is the under-invoicing from China is rampant, and we must stop it. Under-invoicing, we see every day and night that all kinds of goods. Today, Caesar industry people were talking to me. They were saying that the under-invoicing is to the extent of 2%. So this is huge loss to the nation, and we must stop it. Coming to that point, we must raise tariffs, we must stop under-invoicing, and in the longer run, we must see to it that imports from China should become zero.
You want imports to become zero? But Santosh Mehrotra, let's look at the top commodities India is importing from China. Chemical products, plastics, organic chemicals, boilers, machinery, machine appliances, nuclear reactors. A lot of this simply isn't available in India. It's not as if the government isn't trying to reduce imports, it is. But industry requires these chemical products, these plastic articles, organic chemicals, a lot of the pharma APIs coming from China, which are required to be able to make our industry move. How practical is it to implement the kind of suggestions that Ashwini Mahajan and his ilk are making?
And not particularly practical, with all due respect to my very good friend Ashwini ji. Yes, in certain simple consumer goods, like the trader on your show actually talked about plastics, toys, furniture. I think we can begin by banning and perhaps reducing. But I think really for the capital goods that you just mentioned, and especially for the active pharmaceutical ingredients, unless we build up a capacity in our own chemicals industry, which we used to have and we lost, I think it will be impossible to actually reduce that. Let me just mention a few things in response to what I've heard so far. I want to tell your entire audience that between 1992, after the economic reforms began, and all the way till 2014, the contribution of manufacturing to GDP was 16 to 17%, and consistently so. In other words, manufacturing was rising at roughly the same rate as the GDP was rising. The GDP was rising at a rapid clip of about 6.5% in the 90s, and in the period from 2003-4 to 14, it was growing at 8% per annum. So this government inherited a manufacturing contribution to GDP of 17%. Since the last 6 years since demonetization, manufacturing contribution to GDP first fell from 17% to 16 to 15 before COVID, and then it fell to 13 and then 12. So never in the history since our economic reforms began has manufacturing contribution to GDP and manufacturing employment actually fallen in absolute terms. So this is an outcome of the rather poor management of economic policy and of rather poor definition of whatever Make in India means. PLI, we'll wait to see what the benefits of that are.
But it takes time. There's a bit of a lag between coming up with new policies, getting manufacturing plans
so let me talk about, I understand,
and ultimately seeing the output. Just stay with me for a minute. I want to go across to Prasanjit Bose on the point that was made about banning certain visible consumer goods. For example, plastic toys, diyas, furniture. So you can't ban chemicals or pharma APIs. Those are very complex. They'll have a spiral effect on the Indian economy. But there are certain things that people use which comes from China, like Chinese Ganeshas, Chinese Diwali lights, Chinese consumer toys. Ban those. Send a message. It's symbolic for sure. The value of that trade as a percentage of overall trade with China is very low, but it's a message going out across the Himalayas that this is something we're trying to deal with. Would that serve a purpose, or would it largely be notional?
It won't serve any purpose. I think that those who are arguing on these lines are completely ill-informed. And I think that first of all, we need to place this debate on the basis of accurate and correct data. The largest components of India's imports from China comprise of electronic commodities, electronic, like laptops, like integrated circuits, like batteries, which we use for our computers. Now these are, I think that anybody, and many of these are intermediate goods, so they are required to make other goods. They also go in to contribute to India's exports as well. Now, unless and until, what is the real problem? I think that we are reacting to it in a way that the government and its spokespersons and its supporters often react, which is, without any rationality, without any logic. The biggest problem is that why is India unable to make good quality laptops, good quality integrated circuits, good quality lithium batteries, good quality APIs and other pharmaceuticals and organic chemicals at competitive prices, which is the only solution through which you bring down imports from China. You can't do it, and you are unfortunately providing an apology for the government, which has 6-7 years ago announced its intention to develop India's manufacturing through Make in India, which is a complete flop. A complete flop. All the apologists of the government should, first of all, the Prime Minister himself should beg forgiveness from the country for the biggest, flop of his manufacturing policy at a time where we have become, where the government is officially saying that our India's manufacturing sector is going to be developed, and we are witnessing a burgeoning trade deficit and a deindustrialization. And
Sanju Verma, forget the overall percentage. The fact is trade deficit is going up with China. That would suggest that a lot of your talk around PLI, Make in India, etc. hasn't at this moment delivered results. The talk is more than the action, alleges Prasanjit Bose.
Professor
Rahul, can you please ask this gentleman to keep quiet? Mr. Bose, I did not heckle you. Please extend the courtesy to me. Rahul Kanwal, may I make my point?
Sanju Verma, please. Sanju Verma, please.
Thank you. Rahul, it's a lopsided debate, I see. Anyways, let me make some very important points. I will debunk what, and very politely with data, what Professor Mehrotra said and what Prasanjit Bose said. The key ratio is not manufacturing as a percentage of GDP. What you need to see is gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP. Under the Congress-led UPA, the gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP had fallen to an abysmal low of 23%. And Mr. Mehrotra, today the gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP is 32.9%. Point number one. Point number two. Now let me debunk what Professor Bose said. Private final consumption expenditure, PFCE, which denotes the purchasing power of the private sector and to a large extent various stakeholders in the economy. What is PFCE as a percentage of GDP today, Rahul? It was less than 57% under the Congress. Today it is 63.1%.
Okay, Santosh Mehrotra is having a laugh at what you are saying. Just one second. Since you made some arguments, let Santosh Mehrotra come in and respond to what you're saying. I'm coming back to you in a moment. Professor Mehrotra.
Yeah, as far as investment to GDP is concerned, if you look at it historically, our investment to GDP peaked at 38% of GDP in 2008, and this government inherited an investment to GDP ratio of 31%. Since 2015, or rather 2016, investment to GDP has come down. The more important point is that Sanjuji has not listened to what I said, that manufacturing contribution to GDP has actually fallen. And the most important point, I think, and my very short point, is the following, that this government has not adopted an industrial policy. I'm sorry to say even the previous government, after coming up with a manufacturing strategy in 2011 and an electronics design and manufacturing strategy in 2012, was unable to implement it. Its term ended, and this government for the last 8 years has not come up with a industrial policy. Make in India is not an industrial policy. It's all about ease of doing business and come make in India, meaning encouraging FDI. Well, you've seen what the impact of encouraging FDI has been, that our trade deficit with China has been increasing. Now, as far as the 3,000 product tariffs that have been imposed since 2014, well, why is it that our imports of manufactured products have been going up, as Rahul, your reports have been repeatedly saying? So quite clearly, the 3,000 product tariffs that have been imposed by this government are not working. And finally, CII and FICCI have been saying for at least a decade that eliminate the inverted duty structure that we have in this country. What is an inverted duty structure? Very briefly, it means that the tariffs that you impose on finished products are low. That's why finished products, consumer products, and also capital goods are flooding into the country from China and from other countries, while intermediates and raw materials have a high tariff. This is completely illogical. Which are intermediates or raw materials which can be used to produce those same products inside the country, those have a high tariff. This is absurd. This needs to be corrected. CII and FICCI have been saying this.
Okay, Ashwini Mahajan, respond to Santosh Mehrotra's argument that at least at this moment, schemes like production-linked incentives, schemes like Make in India haven't had a material difference in the trade data. You can see some green shoots. Those green shoots will take time to develop and fructify. At this moment, the data speaks for itself. The trade deficit with China has actually grown further.
See, Rahul, you have cut all the trees. And when the when you need more fruits, you say you have seeded the trees, but so far it has not come. It's true, it has not come. I have told you about the. First of all, I would like to take objection to what Prasanjit had said, that we are layman, we don't know data, we don't understand trade. Professor, you must not say all these things. Let me tell you, as I have already said, that during 2004 and 14, during that period, since there was a huge increase, and we have been listening to the speeches of the leaders then, nobody was talking about that. Our industry was being killed. Our API industry was killed like anything. You see, we had 90% of the API requirement being met by our Indian producers, and by the time we reached 2014, 90% we were importing. So what to say? So when we don't have APIs, then how can immediately you start it now?
So let Supriya Srinath respond to your point. You make a very important argument that some of these things take years to set up again. You've planted a tree, it will take time for fruits to come. The fact that we don't have pharma API is not something that gets reversed immediately. It's a work in progress. It will take time before results are visible. Quick final words, Supriya Srinath.
So I will just say two things before I move on to your question, and I'll take 10 seconds to say them. 16 lakh people in this country have renounced their citizenship under the very rule of this government that tells you, and these are mostly high net worth individuals, they're not putting the money where their mouth is, they're not believing in your policies. So that explains why investment is low, and actually gross fixed capital formation is 27% under you. It used to be 32% under us. Just putting the record straight. Your point is well taken, Rahul. Yes, it doesn't take, it can't be done instantly. There has to be a policy, but the policy cannot be to ban apps but increase trade elsewhere. The policy cannot be to ban apps and accept money in the PM CARES fund. The policy can't be to actually crowd out the Indian investors and crowd in the Chinese investors in the startup ecosystem. And very briefly, I will say, false bravado on China has to stop. The government has to take cognizance of the situation, because actually they are funding what China is trying to do at the LAC. There is no other
Sanju Verma, final words that there should be lesser talk and bravado and a more realistic and pragmatic approach about the need for trade with China. While you can try and wean yourself away, it's a very long and arduous process, and that's the communication, rather than saying you're trying to stop it or reduce it.
Okay, I'll just quickly say a couple of things. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. The biggest success story of Make in India is the Covaxin. Apart from that, Samsung has opened in Noida in 2018, one of its biggest facilities outside of its home country. Look at Apple. Apple's exports this year from India are set to touch 20,000 crore. Maruti Suzuki sells more than 5 cars every minute, showing the purchasing power that the Indian consumer has. And I will tell you one more thing, Rahul, one more thing. Please, one more thing.
Sanju.
Supriya Srinath sits here and gives a bhashan. I challenge her. Please divulge the contents of the MOU that Sonia Gandhi signed with the CCP in 2008. What was Rahul Gandhi doing? Flirting with the Chinese ambassador at the
Shut up, yaar. Your Prime Minister went for 18 times. What was he doing? What silly argument?
Rahul Gandhi was flirting with the Chinese at the height of the
18 बार गलबैया कर रहे थे. क्या कर रहे थे प्रधानमंत्री जाकर? आंख नहीं दिखा पा रहे हैं. लाल शर्ट पहन के गाल मिल रहे हैं. अरे चुप रहो. बेवकूफ औरत बकवास करती आकर. हाँ, लाल आंखें दिखा ली थी. लाल शर्ट पहन के गले नहीं मिलना था. एक महीने पहले गले मिल रहे थे ना जब मोदी जी, तो लाल आंखें दिखानी थी. LAC पर आके झड़प करते हैं, ये उनको पैसे भेज रहे हैं. गद्दार कहीं की. चुप, गद्दार.
Okay, this is degenerating. One second. We can't, I'm sorry, I cannot allow the standard of this debate to go straight down to the gutter. We're trying to have a substantive conversation on the problems of trying to reduce trade with China, which is clearly something every fair-thinking Indian would want. There are serious challenges. The challenges need to be overcome with time. We've had some good suggestions. We've also had a bit of tutu meme, and that is just the heat of the moment, the political back and forth between the government and the opposition on the spiraling trade deficit with Beijing.